They didn't just eat the dead because they were starving. They ate the dead because, in that final desperate act, they were trying to prove they were still worth saving. It was the purest form of self-betrayal codified by hunger. Forget the maps, the gold rush fever, or the pristine image of the founding fathers taught in school. The truth of Jamestown 1609 is a horror show staged in mud and desperation, a cold, hard experiment proving how quickly civility dissolves when the sacred boundary is violated. The history books are cowards. They whisper about the starving time, a euphemism so sterile it fails to capture the psychic demolition that occurred that winter. Here is the reality. The famine wasn't a resource crisis. It was the collapse of the internal moral structure. It wasn't about having enough corn. It was about defining the exact point at which survival taxes the human soul beyond repair. This is the hidden mechanism of true crisis. They landed in Virginia seeking fortune, but they found a mirror reflecting their own monstrous capability. When the Powhatan tribes correctly decided that feeding the invasive, useless Englishmen was no longer their job, the walls closed in fast. 66 people were left alive by January 1610, down from 500. Think about that culling rate. Death was everywhere, but dying was simple. Living required unimaginable calculus. The common story mentions the cannibalism, a footnote about desperation. I tell you, it was the defining moment. Before you can lift a knife to the deceased body of your neighbor, you have to kill the part of your mind that recognizes kinship. That is the true starvation. That is the initial permanent damage. Kill the kinship. Break the barrier. They ate dogs, they ate horses, they ate rats. Fine. But once the animals were gone, the whispers started. And the whispers became rationalizations. I want you to look closely at Jane. She was 14 years old, likely a maidservant, recently arrived. When archaeologists in 2012 finally excavated the garbage pit beneath the ruins of a cellar, they didn't just find her skull, they found the brutal receipt for survival. Her skull bore 4 distinct shallow chop marks on the forehead. The cuts were crude, hesitant, but deliberate. They were the marks of someone learning how to butcher. The mandible, the jawbone, was severed cleanly, suggesting a terrifying precision used to access the tongue and the soft tissues of the throat. Her brain matter was missing. They stripped her face clean, not out of malice, but because they needed to forget that this was Jane. Survival demands radical depersonalization. That specific action, removing the identifying features, was the final, total surrender to the animalistic imperative. That depersonalization is the heavy price. If you find the comfort of common, sanitized knowledge restrictive, if you crave the mechanism behind the myth, then perhaps you belong in the company of those who study the dark, unsettling edges of history. What happened to those survivors? They lived. They were saved when supply ships finally arrived, carrying more people who knew nothing of the horror that preceded them. But they were not saved whole. They were walking ghosts, forever trapped between the needs of the flesh and the shattered ruins of their forgotten humanity. The physical hunger ended, yet the psychological tax, the realization that they had, in fact, preferred the taste of their own kind over utter nothingness, that debt remained, compounding interest on their soul for the rest of their short, miserable lives. They were free of the siege, but eternally besieged by memory. Don't pretend you wouldn't do it. You, watching this now, safely positioned in your climate-controlled environment, you harbor the same darkness. That is the crushing reality of the pit. They didn't see a human being, they saw calories. Pure, efficient fuel. This wasn't a moral failure born of weakness. It was cold. Ruthless mathematics applied to terminal desperation. They calculated the precise ROI, the return on investment, of a neighbor's life, weighed against their own continued suffering. Think about the clinical precision of that moment. It's terrifying. They didn't feel guilt in the moment of consumption. Guilt is a fragile, expensive luxury afforded only by full stomachs and predictable tomorrows. They felt relief, a temporary sickening warmth spreading through their malnourished bodies. Then the true agonizing problem began, the reckoning. The narrative creation required to rebuild society atop that fresh dirt. When the supply ships finally sailed back into that desolate harbor, the lie began instantly. It had to. The required shift from "we ate our friends" to "we suffered great hardship." That lie, that institutional erasure of inconvenient horror, is the actual foundation of modern civilization. We require these comfortable, sanitized fictions simply to function without collapsing into screaming anarchy. The returning captains saw the hollow eyes. They smelled the faint, lingering scent of rendered human fat. They recognized the unspoken horror. What did they report back to London? Starvation, scurvy, mismanagement. Never the meat. Never the absolute sin. That truth, that fundamental civilization-shattering truth, had to be excised from the logbooks and sealed permanently in the colonial archives. The cover-up wasn't cynical politics. It was a societal self-defense mechanism. If you value truth over the soft, cushioning pillow of accepted history, if you are willing to study the strategic omissions that form the bulk of what we call the past, then perhaps you belong here. You seek the sharp reality. That is the cost of knowing. The survivors returned to a world that demanded they be heroes, pioneers who suffered valiantly for the future of the crown. What a sickening, bitter joke that was. They knew exactly what they were. They were walking, breathing reminders that the supposed line separating order from savagery is thinner than the finest surgical thread. And that line is drawn not by piety or philosophy or morality. It is drawn solely by the availability of protein. Remove the protein source, the line vanishes entirely. The ultimate betrayal was not of Jane, who was already dead, but of the self. They could never look in a mirror again without seeing the tentative, crude butcher who fumbled the first cut. This trauma, this self-revulsion, it wasn't cured by fresh rations or a return voyage. It became genetic memory. Every subsequent generation built their homes and their empires directly atop that rotten, blood-soaked foundation of necessity. You believe your modern anxieties are products of the digital age? They are not. They are merely the echoing tremors of that ancient hunger. We are all collectively trying to run away from that garbage pit. We build vast, complex architectures of comfort and abundance just to forget that single, terrifying moment of pure, raw calculation. The moment when the human face ceased to be the face of kinship and became instead a terrifyingly detailed resource map. Look at our modern world. We didn't solve the problem of cannibalism. We just outsourced it. We created a system that demands constant ethical sacrifice. A system built on consuming other people's dignity, other people's time, other people's futures, all to ensure that we, personally, never have to calculate the worth of our neighbor's soft tissue. We are still eating each other. We just use better metaphors now. We prefer the clean corporate language of synergy and optimization rather than the honest, guttural sound of bone splitting. It is a refinement of the brutality, not an abandonment of it. We became masters of the hidden feast. You are complicit whether you realize it or not. The safety you enjoy, the food security you take for granted, is simply the current, temporary, effective firewall against your own inherent savagery. Tear that wall down. A single natural disaster, a sudden war, a supply chain collapse, and you realize the terrifying speed at which civilization evaporates. Not collapses slowly, evaporates instantly. The men who ate Jane were not monsters. They were proof. Proof that monster is merely the default state of man when the pantry is empty. We think we escaped the famine. We did not. We simply elevated the stakes. The ancient human fear wasn't merely the agony of starvation. The true primordial terror was the sudden, awful realization that you might be the most valuable resource left. Now look at our cities. Look at the financial markets. We traded meat for numbers, but the underlying equation of competitive consumption remains chillingly identical. We call it ambition. That's a lie. It is prophylaxis. We are trained from the moment we enter the education system, then the job market, to consume opportunity before the person next to us can. We are still racing to the pantry. Only now the pantry holds patents, tenure, and capital, not desiccated rations. Survival means guaranteeing someone else runs out of runway first. The terrifying mechanism of modern scarcity ensures that while we may never literally consume the flesh of our neighbors, we are rigorously trained from infancy to preemptively consume their opportunities, their health resources, and their structural advantages. We do this with surgical precision and call it optimization. This elaborate dance of non-lethal consumption is what allows the collective denial to function. Civilization, fundamentally, is just a massive, self-imposed neurological block. A collective hypnotic suggestion that tells us we are safe, that the fundamental structure of reality has changed. It hasn't. The rules are still zero-sum. If you succeed, someone somewhere failed, and you benefited from that negative space they left behind. It's always been that way. You just weren't supposed to examine the ingredients list of your own life. If this harsh light, if this recognition of the ugly mechanics underlying daily life doesn't make you recoil, but instead makes you lean closer. Perhaps you need to recognize that this channel is built for the few who actually look at the menu. The ultimate ethical compromise is convenience. Convenience is the smooth, polished surface we lay over the ethical garbage pit. Think about it. Every single layer of comfort, from next-day shipping to cheap energy, requires us to willfully ignore an escalating level of externalized violence. We demand distance. We demand cleanliness. We want the result, the warmth, the food, the gadget, without ever touching the sticky, morally ambiguous reality of its production. That distance is the real cost. It breeds a peculiar kind of moral laziness that the truly monstrous understand perfectly well. If you can't see the victim, they don't count. Simple, brutal, highly effective. We became connoisseurs of mediated suffering. We watch trauma on screens, we pity the victims in distant lands, but we never allow that pain to breach the sanctity of our insulated bubble. Because if it breaches the bubble, if you actually feel the weight of global inequality or the environmental debt, then the system grinds to a halt. The gears seize. We cannot afford ethical clarity. Ethical clarity demands sacrifice, and sacrifice means discomfort. We hate discomfort. We run from it. We build systems that make running mandatory. Now consider the power structure itself. Who holds the leverage? The individuals and institutions that possess the ability to rapidly redraw the firewall. They are the gatekeepers of perceived safety. They control the narrative flow about who is in the circle and who is outside. They are the architects of the metaphor. They ensure that your anxiety is focused downward, on your peers, on your competition, on the people struggling just below you, never upward, toward the silent, distant masters of the hidden feast. You fight for the scraps while they control the butcher shop. This distraction is crucial. It keeps the actual structural cannibalism invisible. The greatest trick capitalism ever pulled was convincing the consumer that scarcity was an external force, rather than a manufactured necessity designed to keep the competition desperate. Scarcity drives consumption. Consumption drives the machine. The moment everyone felt truly secure, truly safe, truly fed, the entire edifice of economic coercion would crumble. It would. The fear has to be real. The threat of falling outside the circle must be immediate and terrifying. That's why we work ourselves into dust. We are not working for retirement. We are working to guarantee we are not the ones placed on the menu when the next crisis hits. The grind is the price of not being eaten. The debt is the chain that binds you to the firewall. Look closely at your own behavior. Be honest. When resources tighten, whether it's job opportunities or healthcare access, your first instinct is not cooperation. It is fortification. You hoard information. You sharpen your elbows. You practice the cold calculation that the survivors of the Donner Party perfected. Assess the weakest link and distance yourself from it. We call this strategic networking. We call this professional development. It is the sophisticated, well-dressed version of the primitive huddle around the last remaining fire. We are fundamentally transactional beings. always weighing the input versus the potential yield. Do not deny it. It's in our blood. It's the legacy of Jane. We are not victims of the system. We are the system's perfected product. We are highly trained, self-policing, ethical predators who believe in the illusion of limitless growth and infinite expansion, all because facing the reality of finite resources means facing the fact that the butcher knife is still hanging on the wall, and the rotation of who holds it is constantly being decided in rooms we are not invited to. That knife is the shadow over every major political decision, every economic forecast, every housing crisis. It's the constant, unspoken threat. It ensures compliance. It guarantees participation in the great, civilized feast where dignity is the primary nutrient consumed. Stop lying to yourself. You know the score. You are either eating or being eaten. There is no third option. The butcher knife is still hanging on the wall. We know it. You know it. That knowledge, that cold, sharp reality, is the hidden psychological cost that underwrites this entire monstrous arrangement. You pay the interest on the debt, sure, but the real tax is the vigilance. It is the exhaustion of perpetual self-assessment. Are you still valuable? Are you still performing? Are you still sufficiently dangerous to be left alone? The system demands you answer that question truthfully every single morning, before the coffee even hits. It kills spontaneity. It erodes genuine affection. It forces you to view love itself as a form of strategic alliance, a hedge against loneliness, a practical necessity in the theater of finite resources. You become incapable of simply being. You are always calculating, always measuring the yield. This internal calculator, this constant, draining audit of self and others, that is the ghost in the machine. That is the debt you can never repay. The corrosive acid that eats away at the soul until all that is left is the mechanism of survival. You trade your peace for the right to remain on the board. You exchange vulnerability for solvency. The great achievement of modern civilization is convincing us that this transactional hell is, in fact, freedom. It is not freedom. It is high security incarceration, where the guards look exactly like us. They wear our clothes. They read our books. They answer to the name we gave ourselves. We spend our lives fighting to stay out of the grinding jaws of the machine, only to realize decades too late that we are the machine. We built it. We run it. We fuel it with our fear, our competition, and our utter refusal to admit that the greatest threat was never external. The verdict is definitive. We didn't just sacrifice our leisure to the grindstone. We sacrificed our capacity for unconditional humanity. We did this because being a transactional predator is efficient. It is successful. And in this world, success is the only god that grants immunity. Now, look in the mirror. See the calculation in your own eyes. You work to keep the wolf from the door, but the true horror is realizing you invited the wolf inside years ago, dressed it in your finest clothes, and named it ambition. It's sitting at your table now, sharing your meal. And the final cruel twist of the transaction is this. You cease to be the operator. You become the asset. You are no longer managing the system. You are the highest performing cog within its suffocating mechanism, congratulating yourself on the efficiency of your own enslavement. The grand lie of the spreadsheet life is believing that debt is only quantifiable in currency. The true accounting, the audit that matters, happens not on a ledger but in the silence between breaths. When you realize you are alone on a cold mountain of your own making, surrounded by trophies you no longer care about, and the only person left to call is the one you stopped listening to decades ago. The genuine, uncalculating self. The tax was levied the moment you prioritized statistical success over spiritual integrity. You traded presence for performance. You swapped deep connection for wide networking. The balance sheet looks phenomenal, but your reserves of joy, of simple wonder, of unconditional acceptance, those accounts are overdrawn, perpetually operating in the red. We chase the horizon, desperately trying to prove our value to a machine that has no capacity for human appreciation. We never arrive. Why? Because the chase is the product. Your anxiety is profitable. Your fear of irrelevance is the fuel. Look at the people around you. Watch how quickly they size you up, not for who you are, but for what you might provide. That isn't paranoia. That is the necessary survival instinct sharpened by a system built entirely on selective utility. We have achieved maximum material density, but we've engineered an existence of maximum emotional scarcity. This system, this great transactional apparatus we call the modern economy, is not merely extracting labor, it is extracting the very possibility of quiet contentment. It demands you stay agitated. It demands you stay hungry. It demands you stay terrified of the moment the music stops and you discover you have nothing left to offer. It is the ultimate paradox of success. You gain everything the world values and lose everything that actually makes life worth living. You cannot negotiate with calculator now. It has become fused with your consciousness, judging every interaction, every spontaneous smile, every fleeting thought of rest as an inefficient use of capital. You thought you were securing your position. You only secured your isolation. The verdict is definitive, chilling, and final. The greatest psychological cost is realizing that you finally achieved solvency. But the price of that achievement was the permanent foreclosure on your soul. You might have won the game, but the prize was nothing more than a permanent, soundproofed cage built entirely out of your own ambition. Now, try to sleep. The wolf knows where you live, and it knows your name. Stop negotiating with the terms of your own imprisonment. The modern project of success is a colossal, tragic fraud. It sold you permanence but delivered only a pristine, tailored panic. You are not rich, you are merely optimized debt. Debt owed to the very self you systematically dismantled. The machine doesn't care if you win, it only cares that you keep playing. So, look around your perfect life, that monument to efficiency, and ask this one final dreadful question. If you finally stopped running, would anyone notice the sign